Picture this. You're lying on an operating table, unconscious and completely vulnerable. Above you, a team of highly trained surgeons suddenly freezes in terror. Equipment fails. Monitors scream warnings. Chaos erupts in what should be the most controlled environment in the hospital. But then, from the shadows of the operating room, steps a nurse who rarely speaks. She's been there for years, always quiet, always in the background. Everyone assumed she was just another ordinary staff member going through the motions. They were wrong. Dead wrong. What happens next will shatter everything you think you know about the person standing beside you during your most vulnerable moment. Because sometimes the most extraordinary people hide behind the most ordinary masks. And sometimes when death comes knocking at the operating room door, it takes a secret that's been buried for decades to send it away empty-handed. This is the true story of how one woman's hidden past turned a medical nightmare into a miracle that no one saw coming. The overhead lights in Operating Room 7 cast their familiar sterile glow as Dr. Sarah Martinez adjusted her surgical mask for the third time. Something felt different about this Tuesday morning at St. Catherine's Medical Center, though she couldn't quite put her finger on what. The patient on the table, a 42-year-old construction worker named Miguel Santos, lay unconscious and prepped for what should have been a routine gallbladder removal. "Scalpel," Dr. Martinez called out, extending her gloved hand with practiced confidence. 23 years of surgery had taught her to trust her instincts, and right now, those instincts were humming with an odd tension. The surgical team moved with choreographed precision around the table. Dr. James Chun, the anesthesiologist, monitored his equipment with sharp focus. Nurse Patricia Williams prepared instruments with mechanical efficiency. And in the corner, almost invisible against the white walls, stood Elena Volkov. Elena had worked at St. Catherine's for 8 years, but most of the staff barely knew her name. She spoke in whispers when she spoke at all, kept her graying hair pulled back in a severe bun, and performed her duties with quiet competence. Some colleagues joked that she was like a ghost, appearing when needed and vanishing just as quickly. Others wondered why someone so withdrawn had chosen a career in the intense environment of surgical nursing. What none of them knew was that Elena carried secrets that could fill volumes. Dr. Martinez made the first incision, her movement steady and sure. The operation began like thousands of others she had performed. Miguel's vitals remained stable on the monitors, their electronic beeps providing a reassuring rhythm to the procedure. Everything was proceeding according to plan. "Looking good so far," Dr. Chun murmured from behind his anesthesia station. "Blood pressure holding steady, oxygen levels perfect." Elena moved silently between the shadows, anticipating needs before they were voiced, preparing backup supplies with an efficiency that bordered on uncanny. She had developed this sixth sense over years of working in high-pressure situations, though the other nurses assumed it was just experience from her time in various hospitals. They had no idea that Elena's real education had come from places where a single mistake could mean the difference between life and death on a scale they couldn't imagine. 15 minutes into the surgery, Dr. Martinez had successfully isolated the inflamed gallbladder and was preparing for removal. The organ was more diseased than the preoperative scans had suggested, but nothing beyond her considerable skill to handle. She worked with focused determination, aware that Miguel's wife and 2 young children were waiting in the family lounge, probably wearing holes in the carpet with their anxious pacing. "Clips," she requested, and Nurse Williams handed over the surgical clips with practiced efficiency. That's when everything changed. The first sign of trouble came from Dr. Chen's station. A soft alarm chimed once, then twice. He frowned at his monitors, tapping one of the screens with his finger. "That's odd," he muttered. "I'm getting some irregular readings here." Dr. Martinez paused, her hands still inside Miguel's abdomen. "What kind of irregular?" "Blood pressure's dropping. Not dramatically, but consistently. And his oxygen saturation is starting to fluctuate." Elena's head turned sharply toward the anesthesia station. In the corner of her eye, Dr. Martinez caught the movement and noticed something she had never seen before. Elena's usually passive face had transformed. Her eyes had become intensely focused, scanning the monitors with the precision of someone reading critical intelligence. "Let me check his airway," Dr. Chen said, adjusting Miguel's position slightly. But the readings continued to deteriorate. Dr. Martinez felt her heart rate increase. "How's his temperature?" "Rising," Dr. Chen replied, his voice now carrying the first edge of concern. "This is starting to look like he never finished the sentence." Miguel's body began to tremor on the table. "He's going into shock," Nurse Williams announced, her voice tight with professional alarm. The monitors erupted in a symphony of warnings. Blood pressure plummeted. Heart rate soared. Oxygen levels dropped like a stone falling into an abyss. In the space of 30 seconds, a routine surgery had become a life-threatening emergency. Dr. Martinez's training kicked in automatically. "Give me more suction. I need to close him up now." But Dr. Chun shook his head grimly. "Sarah, look at these numbers. Something's wrong with his system. This isn't surgical shock. This is something else entirely." Elena stepped forward from her position against the wall. For the first time since anyone could remember, she spoke in a clear, authoritative voice that carried across the operating room like a bell. "Doctor, you need to stop the anesthesia immediately and check for malignant hyperthermia." Every head in the room turned toward her. Dr. Chen blinked in surprise. "What did you say?" "Malignant hyperthermia," Elena repeated, moving closer to the anesthesia station with sudden purpose. His muscle rigidity, the rapid temperature rise, the cardiovascular instability. These are classic early signs. Dr. Martinez felt ice water flood her veins. Malignant hyperthermia was a rare but potentially fatal reaction to certain anesthetic agents. If Elena was right, Miguel could die within minutes. But the preoperative screening didn't indicate any family history, Dr. Chen protested, even as his hands moved to adjust his equipment settings. "Family history isn't always documented," Elena said, her voice gaining strength and confidence with each word, "especially in families where medical records are incomplete or inaccessible." Dr. Martinez stared at the quiet nurse who had suddenly become the most important person in the room. "Elena, how do you know this?" But Elena was already moving, pulling open supply cabinets with the certainty of someone who had navigated similar crises before. "We need dantrolene, and we need it now. Nurse Williams, can you call pharmacy for an emergency delivery?" "Already on it," Patricia replied, grabbing the phone with one hand while helping to prepare emergency medications with the other. Miguel's condition continued to deteriorate. His body temperature spiked to dangerous levels. His muscles became rigid, fighting against the ventilator that was trying to keep him alive. The monitors painted a picture of a man whose body was essentially cooking itself from the inside. Elena worked with smooth efficiency, preparing cooling measures and calculating medication dosages with mathematical precision. Her movements were those of someone who had faced life and death situations countless times before, though none of her colleagues could imagine where a surgical nurse from St. Catherine's would have gained such experience. "Ice packs under his arms and around his neck," she instructed, her accent becoming more pronounced as stress sharpened her focus. "We need to bring his core temperature down while we wait for the dantrolene." Dr. Chen looked at her with new respect and growing puzzlement. "Elena, where did you learn to recognize malignant hyperthermia so quickly? Most nurses wouldn't catch this in the early stages." Elena's hands never stopped working as she replied, "Sometimes experience comes from places you don't expect." The pharmacy team burst through the operating room doors with the emergency dantrolene. Elena immediately began preparing the medication, her movements so swift and confident that even Dr. Martinez found herself stepping back to let the nurse take the lead. "Elena," the surgeon said quietly, "I think you need to tell us what we're dealing with here." For a moment, Elena's hands paused over the medication vials. When she looked up, her eyes held depths that none of them had ever noticed before. "What you're dealing with," she said softly, "is someone who has seen this exact situation before in places where there was no pharmacy team, no emergency protocols, and no room for error. She returned to her work, drawing up the medication with practiced precision. What you're dealing with is someone who learned medicine in field hospitals, where the only options were save the patient or watch them die. The room fell silent except for the beeping monitors and the hiss of the ventilator. Dr. Martinez felt the pieces of a puzzle beginning to form in her mind, though the picture they created seemed impossible. Field hospitals? Dr. Chin asked quietly. Elena looked up at him as she handed over the prepared dantrolene. Doctor, right now Miguel needs this medication more than you need my life story. But, yes, field hospitals. In places where conflict makes traditional medical training a luxury that most people can't afford. As Dr. Chun administered the life-saving drug, Elena continued her cooling procedures with the efficiency of someone who had performed them under much more difficult circumstances. Ice packs were applied with strategic precision. Additional 4 lines were started for fluid resuscitation. Every action was calculated and purposeful. Nada, Martinez said, working to stabilize Miguel's surgical site while the medical crisis played out around her. When this is over, we need to talk. Yes, doctor, Elena replied, monitoring Miguel's vital signs with hawk-like attention. I expect we do. The dantrolene began to take effect. Slowly, incrementally, Miguel's body temperature started to decline. His muscle rigidity began to ease. The monitors that had been screaming warnings began to quiet to more manageable alarms. Elena stood beside the anesthesia station, her eyes never leaving the monitors, her hands ready to assist with any additional interventions. For the first time since joining the staff at St. Catherine's, she looked like what she truly was, someone who had faced impossible medical situations and emerged with skills that couldn't be taught in any American nursing school. His temperature's dropping, Dr. Chun announced with relief evident in his voice. Muscle rigidity is decreasing. We might have caught this in time. Dr. Martinez worked quickly to close Miguel's incisions, her mind racing with questions about the woman who had just saved her patient's life. Elena remained focused on Miguel's recovery, but the surgeon could see something different in her posture now. The invisible nurse who had haunted the corners of Operating Room 7 had revealed herself to be someone entirely unexpected. As Miguel's vital signs continued to stabilize, Elena finally stepped back from the monitors. The immediate crisis had passed, but the questions it raised were just beginning. Elena, Dr. Martinez said, securing the final suture, where exactly did you learn to recognize malignant hyperthermia symptoms that quickly? Elena's response was quiet but clear. In places where recognizing it slowly meant people died, doctor. In places where medical supplies were limited and knowledge was the only thing that could save lives. She paused, looking at Miguel's now stable form on the operating table. In places where I learned that sometimes the person who appears to know the least actually knows the most. Dr. Chin finished adjusting Miguel's anesthesia for the recovery phase. Elena, I've been practicing anesthesiology for 15 years, and I've only seen 3 cases of malignant hyperthermia. You spotted this faster than I did. Experience has a way of sharpening recognition. Doctor, Elena replied, especially when that experience comes from situations where second chances don't exist. Dr. Martinez stripped off her surgical gloves, her mind reeling with the implications of what had just happened. Miguel Santos was alive because of Elena's intervention. Without her quick identification of the symptoms, he would likely have died on the table despite all their efforts. Elena, I think it's time we learn more about your background, the surgeon said. Because what just happened here tells me there's a lot more to your story than anyone realized. Elena nodded slowly, understanding that her years of carefully maintained invisibility were about to end. Yes, doctor. I believe it is time for that conversation. As the team prepared to transfer Miguel to recovery, Elena gathered her supplies with the same quiet efficiency she had always displayed. But now her colleagues saw her differently. The ghost who had moved through their operating room for 8 years had revealed herself to be someone with medical knowledge that had been forged in circumstances none of them could imagine. The questions that filled the air around Miguel's recovering form were about to uncover a story that stretched back decades and across continents, involving conflicts and experiences that would challenge everything the staff of St. Catherine's thought they knew about the quiet nurse who had just saved a life. Elena Volkov's secret was about to be revealed, and, with it, a tale of medical heroism that had been hidden in plain sight for nearly a decade. 2 hours later, Miguel Santos rested peacefully in the recovery unit, his vital signs stable and his prognosis excellent. His wife Carmen held his hand while their children whispered prayers of gratitude they barely understood. None of them knew how close they had come to losing husband and father that morning, or that their salvation had come from the most unlikely source imaginable. In the staff lounge, an unusual gathering was taking place. Dr. Sarah Martinez sat across from Elena Volkov at a small table, while Dr. James Chin occupied a chair nearby. Nurse Patricia Williams had joined them, along with Dr. Robert Hayes, the chief of surgery, who had been called in to discuss the morning's events. Elena sat with her hands folded in her lap, her usual invisibility replaced by a quiet dignity that seemed to fill the space around her. For 8 years, she had been part of the furniture at St. Catherine's. Today, she had become the center of attention, and everyone in the room knew they were about to hear something extraordinary. Dr. Hayes spoke first, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had run a surgical department for over 2 decades. Elena, what happened in that operating room this morning was nothing short of remarkable. Your recognition of malignant hyperthermia quite literally saved Miguel Santos's life. Elena nodded slightly, but said nothing, waiting for the questions she knew were coming. Dr. Martinez leaned forward. Elena, I've worked with you for 3 years, and I've never seen you demonstrate that level of medical knowledge. Your response was faster and more accurate than most attending physicians would manage. Where did you learn to recognize those symptoms so quickly? Elena was quiet for a long moment, her eyes focused on her hands. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of memories that stretched back across decades and continents. I learned to recognize malignant hyperthermia in a field hospital outside Sarajevo in 1994, she said quietly. A 12-year-old boy was brought in with shrapnel wounds requiring immediate surgery. We had limited anesthetic agents and no access to emergency medications. The room fell completely silent. Dr. Chin set down his coffee cup with extra care, as if sudden movements might break the spell of Elena's revelation. The boy developed malignant hyperthermia during the procedure, Elena continued, her accent becoming more pronounced as she delved into painful memories. We had no dantrolene, no proper monitoring equipment, no backup systems. We lost him. She looked up at the assembled medical professionals, her eyes reflecting pain that had been carried for nearly 30 years. I swore that day that I would never again fail to recognize those symptoms, no matter where I was or what resources I had available. Dr. Hayes cleared his throat softly. Elena, when you say field hospital in Sarajevo, I mean exactly that, doctor. I was a trauma surgeon during the Bosnian War. I operated in basements, in abandoned buildings, in shelters while shells fell around us. I learned medicine in places where textbook procedures were luxuries we couldn't afford. Patricia Williams gasped audibly. You're a surgeon. Elena's smile held no humor. I was a surgeon. Dr. Elena Volkov, trauma surgery specialist at Sarajevo General Hospital before the war, field surgeon for humanitarian organizations during the conflict, and, eventually, refugee seeking asylum in the United States. The revelation hit the room like a physical force. Dr. Martinez stared at the woman she had worked beside for years, trying to reconcile the quiet nurse with the image of a war-zone surgeon operating under impossible conditions. Elena, Dr. Chun said slowly, why are you working as a surgical nurse if you're a trained surgeon? Elena's expression became resigned, as if she had known this conversation would eventually come. Because Dr. Elena Volkov died in Bosnia along with most of her credentials, her references, and her documented training. The woman who arrived in America in 1997 was a refugee with limited English and no way to prove her medical qualifications. She paused, gathering her thoughts before continuing. The medical board required me to complete American residency training to practice as a surgeon. I was 42 years old, spoke broken English, and had 2 teenage children to support. I couldn't afford to spend years in residency training when I needed to work immediately. Dr. Hayes frowned. But surely your experience would have counted for something? The medical board has provisions for foreign-trained physicians. In theory, yes, Elena replied. In practice, documenting surgical experience gained in field hospitals during a war zone proved impossible. Most of the hospitals I worked in were destroyed. Many of the colleagues who could vouch for my experience were dead or scattered across the globe as refugees themselves. Elena stood and walked to the window overlooking the hospital's healing garden. So Elena Volkov, the surgeon, became Elena Volkov, the nursing assistant. Then, eventually Elena Volkov, the surgical nurse. It was the closest I could get to practicing the medicine I loved without spending years proving I was qualified to do what I had already been doing under much more difficult circumstances. Dr. Martinez felt a wave of emotion she couldn't quite name. Elena, that's heartbreaking. You've been working below your qualifications for 8 years. Elena turned back to the group, her expression showing a mixture of sadness and acceptance. It's been 26 years, actually, but I've never stopped being a surgeon in my heart. I've simply learned to practice surgery through the hands and voices of others. The statement hung in the air as each doctor in the room considered the implications. How many times had Elena anticipated their needs during surgery? How many complications had she helped them avoid through subtle suggestions or perfectly timed assistance? Patricia Williams spoke up, her voice filled with new understanding. Elena, all these years when you seemed to know exactly what instruments we would need, when you prepared supplies before anyone asked. I was thinking like a surgeon while working as a nurse, Elena confirmed. I was seeing the procedures through a surgeon's eyes and trying to support you in ways that wouldn't reveal my background. Dr. Chen shook his head in amazement. The number of times you've helped me with difficult intubations or suggested positioning changes that made procedures easier. You're a good anesthesiologist, Dr. Chun, Elena said with a slight smile. But I've worked with anesthesiologists in situations where mistakes were immediately fatal. I learned to recognize problems before they became crises. Dr. Hayes stood and began pacing, his mind clearly racing with the possibilities Elena's revelation presented. Elena, this changes everything. Your experience, your knowledge, your skills. We need to explore options for getting you back into surgical practice. Elena's expression became guarded. Dr. Hayes, I appreciate the thought, but I've investigated those options many times over the years. The barriers remain significant, and I'm now 58 years old. The likelihood of completing residency requirements at my age. Wait, Dr. Martinez interrupted. What about the state's provisions for experienced foreign physicians? There are pathways for practitioners with extensive experience to demonstrate competency without full residency. Elena Sigid. Those pathways require documentation and references from recognized institutions. As I mentioned, most of my references are unavailable, and my experience was gained in circumstances that don't translate well to American medical bureaucracy. Dr. Hayes stopped pacing and looked directly at Elena. What if I told you that St. Catherine's Medical Center has significant influence with the state medical board? And what if I mentioned that we have connections with international medical organizations that might be able to help document your wartime service? For the first time since the conversation began, Elena looked genuinely surprised. I hadn't considered that possibility. Dr. Chen leaned forward eagerly. Elena, think about what you've been doing here. You've been practicing surgery indirectly for years. You have 8 years of documented performance at St. Catherine's, including today's life-saving intervention. That has to count for something. Elena sat back down, her composure finally beginning to crack. Doctors, I gave up the dream of returning to surgery years ago. I made peace with my role as a nurse. I found ways to use my knowledge to help without seeking recognition. But you shouldn't have to hide your abilities, Patricia said firmly. What you did today proved that your surgical knowledge and instincts are not only intact, but superior to most practicing physicians. The medical community is losing your expertise every day. You're not allowed to practice to your full potential. Elena's eyes filled with tears she had been holding back for decades. You don't understand what it's like to have your entire professional identity erased by circumstances beyond your control. To go from being the surgeon everyone calls for complex trauma cases to being invisible in an American hospital. Dr. Martinez reached across the table and touched Elena's hand gently. Elena, you've never been invisible to me. I just didn't understand what I was seeing. Looking back, I can remember dozens of times when your suggestions or assistance made me a better surgeon. I thought it was just exceptional nursing. Now I realize you were mentoring me without either of us acknowledging it. The room fell silent as Elena struggled with emotions she had suppressed for years. Finally, she spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. In Sarajevo, I was head of trauma surgery at the city's main hospital. When the siege began, I stayed to help. For 3 years, I operated on civilians, children, soldiers, anyone who needed help, regardless of their side in the conflict. She paused, gathering strength to continue. I performed amputations without proper anesthesia, removed bullets with improvised instruments, and saved lives in conditions that would horrify any American physician. I did it because it was necessary, because people would die if I didn't. Dr. Hayes sat down heavily, clearly moved by Elena's story. Elena, that level of experience under extreme conditions, that's not something that can be taught in any residency program. That's knowledge that comes from facing life and death repeatedly under impossible circumstances. Elena nodded slowly. But it's also knowledge that's difficult to document or validate through traditional channels. Who do I list as references? The hospitals that were destroyed, the colleagues who were killed, the patients who couldn't survive despite my best efforts. Dr. Chun spoke thoughtfully. Elena, what if we approach this differently? What if we focus on your demonstrated competence here at St. Catherine's rather than trying to document your wartime experience? Elena looked puzzled. I'm not sure what you mean. Dr. Martinez's eyes lit up with sudden understanding. He means we document your knowledge and skills through what you've accomplished here. Today's recognition of malignant hyperthermia, for instance. That level of diagnostic accuracy under pressure demonstrates medical knowledge that goes far beyond nursing training. Dr. Hayes nodded enthusiastically. Exactly. We could arrange for you to undergo competency evaluations, skills assessments, even oral examinations by board-certified surgeons. If you can demonstrate current surgical knowledge and capabilities that might provide the documentation you need. Elena stared at them, hope and fear warring in her expression. Doctors, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but the medical board's requirements are very specific. Even if I could prove my competence, there are still issues of liability, supervision, and... Elena, Dr. Hayes interrupted gently. Let me worry about the bureaucratic obstacles. What I'm hearing from my surgical team is that we have a highly skilled surgeon working as a nurse because administrative barriers prevented her from practicing at her appropriate level. That's not just unfair to you. It's a disservice to every patient who could benefit from your expertise. Patricia Williams spoke up again. Elena, I've worked with surgical nurses for 20 years. What I've seen you do goes far beyond nursing, even exceptional nursing. You think like a surgeon because you are a surgeon. Elena sat quietly for several minutes, processing the unexpected turn her morning had taken. She had arrived at work expecting another routine day of invisible competence. Instead, her carefully maintained cover had been blown by a medical emergency that demanded she reveal her true capabilities. If I were to consider this, she said slowly, what would the process involve? Dr. Hayes smiled for the first time since entering the room. First, we need to meet with the hospital's administration and legal team to understand our options. Then we contact the state medical board to explore pathways for experienced foreign physicians. Finally, we work with professional organizations that specialize in credentialing international medical professionals. Dr. Martinez added, and Elena, throughout this process, you'll have the full support of the surgical department. What happened today proved that you're not just qualified to be a surgeon. You're the kind of surgeon who saves lives when others might fail. Elena's voice was thick with emotion when she finally responded. 26 years. For 26 years, I've carried the knowledge and skills of a trauma surgeon while working in roles that utilized only a fraction of my capabilities. I had given up hope that I would ever be allowed to return to surgery. Dr. Chen leaned back in his chair. Elena, hope is what today was about. Miguel Santos is alive because you hadn't given up your surgical instincts. That has to mean something in terms of getting you back where you belong. Elena wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, her composure finally breaking completely. Doctors, you don't understand what this means to me. Surgery isn't just what I do, it's who I am. Being forced to practice medicine indirectly has been like being allowed to breathe, but not allowed to live. The profound sadness in her voice affected everyone in the room. These medical professionals who dealt with life and death regularly found themselves confronted with a different kind of tragedy. The loss of a brilliant surgeon to administrative obstacles and bureaucratic indifference. Dr. Hayes stood and walked around the table to place a hand on Elena's shoulder. Elena, as chief of surgery at this hospital, I'm making you a promise. We're going to explore every possible avenue to get you back into surgical practice. Your knowledge and skills are too valuable to waste, and, frankly, we need surgeons with your level of experience. Elena looked up at him with gratitude and something else, the beginning of hope she hadn't dared to feel in decades. Dr. Hayes, she said quietly, if there's truly a chance to return to surgery, to practice medicine at the level I was trained for, then yes. Yes, I want to try. The room erupted in smiles and words of encouragement, but Elena's mind was already racing ahead to possibilities she had buried long ago. The ghost of Operating Room 7 was about to become very real indeed. 3 weeks after the incident in Operating Room 7, the conference room at St. Catherine's Medical Center buzzed with unusual activity. Dr. Robert Hayes had assembled what he privately called Elena's Liberation Committee, a group of medical professionals, administrators, and legal experts dedicated to solving a problem that had persisted for over 2 decades. Elena sat at the far end of the polished table, no longer the invisible nurse who haunted surgical suites. Word of her dramatic intervention had spread throughout the hospital, and she found herself the subject of whispered conversations and curious glances. Some colleagues looked at her with new respect. Others seemed almost afraid, as if they had discovered they had been working alongside a medical ghost. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Hayes began. We're here to discuss the case of Dr. Elena Volkov, a board-certified surgeon from Bosnia who has been working below her qualifications for over 26 years due to documentation and credentialing issues. Seated around the table were Dr. Martinez, Dr. Chun, Patricia Williams, Hospital Administrator Margaret Foster, Legal Counsel David Kim, and Dr. Sullivan from the International Medical Graduate Office at the State Medical Board. Dr. Sullivan had driven 3 hours from the state capital specifically to meet Elena after Dr. Hayes had called in several professional favors. She was a small woman with steel gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. Dr. Volkov, Dr. Sullivan began, I've reviewed the preliminary information Dr. Hayes provided, and your situation presents some unique challenges. However, it's not the first time we've encountered a highly qualified physician whose credentials were lost to war or political upheaval. Elena nodded carefully. Dr. Sullivan, I understand that my situation is complicated. I've accepted that my original credentials cannot be recovered. Actually, Dr. Sullivan interrupted with a slight smile. You might be surprised what we can accomplish with modern technology and international cooperation. But before we discuss documentation, I'd like to understand your current knowledge base. She pulled out a thick folder and placed it on the table. Dr. Hayes mentioned that you've maintained your surgical knowledge over the years. Can you walk me through your approach to trauma surgery protocols, particularly in resource-limited environments? Elena's eyes lit up with the first genuine enthusiasm anyone had seen from her in weeks. Certainly, in trauma surgery, especially when resources are limited, the primary principle is damage control. You prioritize immediately life-threatening injuries while stabilizing the patient for definitive care later. For the next 30 minutes, Elena outlined surgical approaches with a precision and depth that impressed even the experienced physicians in the room. She discussed innovative techniques for managing hemorrhage, creative uses of available materials, and decision-making processes that balanced risk against available resources. Dr. Sullivan took extensive notes, occasionally asking follow-up questions that demonstrated her own considerable knowledge. When Elena finished, the room was silent with something approaching awe. Dr. Volkov, Dr. Sullivan said slowly, "In 30 years of working with international medical graduates, I've rarely encountered someone who maintains such current knowledge while working outside their specialty. Your understanding of modern trauma protocols, combined with your innovation in resource-limited settings, represents exactly the kind of experience our medical system needs." Elena's voice carried a note of caution. "Dr. Sullivan, my knowledge is current because I've never stopped learning. But there's a significant difference between theoretical knowledge and hands-on surgical practice." Margaret Foster, the hospital administrator, leaned forward. "Elena, that's actually something we can address. We've been exploring the possibility of having you work alongside our surgical team in a supervised capacity while your credentialing is processed." David Kim, the legal counsel, nodded. "We've identified several precedents for this approach. The state has provisions for experienced physicians to demonstrate competency through supervised practice while completing administrative requirements." Elena felt her heart racing. Supervised practice? Dr. Hayes smiled broadly. "Elena, what we're proposing is that you begin working as a surgical resident under my direct supervision. Your salary would reflect your experience level, and you'd gradually take on more responsibility as you demonstrate competency in the American medical system." Elena stared at him. "Dr. Hayes, I'm 58 years old. I haven't been the primary surgeon on a case in over 26 years. Dr. Martinez spoke up from across the table. "Elena, 3 weeks ago you diagnosed malignant hyperthermia faster than any of us. Your surgical instincts aren't just intact. They're superior to most practicing surgeons. Age isn't the issue here." Dr. Sullivan pulled out another document. "Dr. Volkov, I've been in contact with the International Committee of the Red Cross. They maintain records of medical personnel who worked in conflict zones, including Bosnia during the 1990s. Elena's eyes widened. "You found records of my service?" "Better than that, Dr. Sullivan replied with satisfaction. "We found Dr. Marina Petric. She was the director of medical services for the Red Cross in Sarajevo during the siege. She not only remembers you, but has been trying to track down former colleagues for years to help them rebuild their careers." Elena's hand went to her throat. "Marina is alive?" "Marina Petric. Very much alive, and now working as a consultant for international medical credentialing. She's prepared to provide detailed documentation of your surgical experience, your training, and your performance under extreme conditions." Tears filled Elena's eyes. "Marina was my mentor during the war. She taught me how to operate in impossible circumstances, how to make life and death decisions with incomplete information." Dr. Sullivan continued. "Dr. Petric has agreed to provide sworn testimony regarding your surgical competence. Combined with documentation from other survivors of your medical team, we can build a comprehensive record of your qualifications." Patricia Williams smiled broadly. "Elena, it sounds like your credentials aren't lost after all. They've just been scattered across the globe, waiting for someone to put the pieces back together." Elena wiped her eyes, struggling to process the sudden resurrection of hope she had buried decades ago. "Dr. Sullivan, what would this mean in practical terms?" "It means, Dr. Volkov, that we can fast-track your credentialing process. Instead of requiring you to complete a full residency, we can arrange for competency evaluations, skills assessments, and supervised practice that recognizes your existing expertise. Dr. Hayes leaned back in his chair with obvious satisfaction. Elena, what we're offering is a pathway back to surgery that acknowledges who you are rather than treating you as someone who needs to start over. Elena's voice was barely audible. How long would this process take? Dr. Sullivan consulted her notes. With the documentation we can provide, the state board could approve your provisional license within 60 days. You could begin supervised practice immediately while we complete the full credentialing process. Elena sat in stunned silence, trying to absorb the magnitude of what was being offered. For over 2 decades, she had accepted that her surgical career was over. She had made peace with working in the shadows, supporting other surgeons while suppressing her own abilities. David Kim spoke up. Elena, there are some legal considerations we need to discuss. Working under supervised practice requires specific protocols and documentation. You'd essentially be functioning as a senior resident with accelerated responsibility based on your experience. Dr. Martinez added, Elena, I'd be honored to work with you during this transition. Having a surgeon with your background join our team would benefit not just you, but every patient we treat. Elena looked around the table at the faces that had become allies in her fight to reclaim her professional identity. A month ago, she had been invisible. Today, she was the center of an effort involving multiple institutions and international organizations. Dr. Hayes, she said quietly, if I do this, if I return to surgery, I need to be certain I can meet the standards expected of a surgeon at this hospital. It's been so many years since I held primary responsibility for a patient's life. Dr. Hayes smiled. Elena, you've been carrying that responsibility for 8 years. You just haven't been acknowledged for it. What happened with Miguel Santos proved that your instincts and knowledge are not only intact, but exceptional. Elena stood and walked to the window overlooking the surgical wing where she had spent so many years in the shadows. In Sarajevo, surgery was about survival. Every patient who came through our doors was fighting for their life, and we were their only hope. She turned back to the group. Here, surgery can be about much more than survival. It could be about restoring quality of life, about giving people hope for their future. I've watched American surgeons perform miracles that would have been impossible in wartime conditions. Dr. Chin spoke thoughtfully. Elena, you're bringing experience that none of us have. Your ability to make critical decisions under pressure, to innovate with limited resources, to remain calm in chaos. Those are skills that can't be taught. They can only be learned through experience. Elena nodded slowly. Dr. Chun, during the siege of Sarajevo, I once operated for 18 hours straight during a bombardment. We had no electricity, so we used car headlights. We had no proper anesthetics, so we used whatever we could find. We saved 12 lives that night. The room was completely silent as Elena continued. But here, in this hospital, with these resources and this technology, we could save so many more. We could do surgery that restores not just life, but quality of life. Margaret Foster cleared her throat. Elena, what you're describing is exactly why we need to get you back into surgery. Your perspective, your experience, your skills, they represent a unique resource that we've been wasting. Dr. Sullivan gathered her documents. Dr. Volkov, I'm returning to the capital tomorrow to begin the formal credentialing process. Based on what I've heard today and the documentation we can provide, I'm confident we can have you practicing surgery within 2 months. Elena's voice carried a strength that had been missing for years. Dr. Sullivan, yes. Yes, I want to return to surgery. I want to practice medicine at the level I was trained for. She paused, looking around the table one more time. But I want to be clear about something. I'm not doing this just for myself. I'm doing this because patients deserve to have access to all available medical expertise, regardless of the path that expertise took to get here. Dr. Hayes stood and extended his hand. Dr. Volkov, welcome back to surgery. As Elena shook his hand, she felt something she hadn't experienced in over 2 decades. The anticipation of returning to the operating room not as a shadow, but as a surgeon. The invisible woman of St. Catherine's Medical Center was about to become very visible indeed. 2 hours later, Elena stood alone in operating room 7, the same room where her secret had been revealed 3 weeks earlier. She placed her hand on the operating table where Miguel Santos had nearly died, remembering the moment when her carefully constructed invisibility had shattered. "Dr. Volkov?" a voice said from behind her. Elena turned to find Dr. Martinez standing in the doorway. "Sarah," Elena said, using the surgeon's first name for the first time. "I was just saying goodbye," Dr. Martinez suggested, stepping into the room. Elena nodded. "In a way. For 8 years, this room has been my sanctuary and my prison. I could practice medicine here, but only through other people's hands." Dr. Martinez moved to stand beside her. "Elena, when you return to surgery, you're going to find that it's different from what you remember. The technology, the protocols, the expectations, everything has evolved." Elena smiled. "Sarah, evolution is something I understand. I've been watching American surgery evolve for 8 years. I've learned your techniques, your technologies, your approaches. I've just been learning them from the shadows." Dr. Martinez looked at her with new understanding. "You've been preparing for this moment, even though you didn't think it would ever come." "A surgeon never stops being a surgeon," Elena replied. "Even when circumstances force them to practice medicine indirectly, the surgical mind continues to work, to learn, to grow." Elena took one last look around operating room 7, then turned toward the door. "Sarah, when I return here as a surgeon, I want you to know that I'll never forget the lessons I learned working in the shadows. Sometimes the most important medical knowledge comes from understanding what it means to be powerless." As they walked out together, Dr. Martinez realized that St. Catherine's Medical Center was about to gain not just a skilled surgeon, but a physician whose understanding of medicine had been forged in circumstances that most American doctors couldn't imagine. Elena Volkov's journey back to surgery was just beginning, but already she had transformed from an invisible nurse into a symbol of resilience, expertise, and hope. 8 weeks later, operating room 7 hummed with a different energy than anyone could remember. At the surgical table stood Dr. Elena Volkov, no longer invisible, no longer silent, and no longer relegated to the shadows. Today marked her 15th supervised surgery since returning to practice, and the transformation had been nothing short of extraordinary. The patient was Maria Gonzalez, a 63-year-old grandmother who had been brought to St. Catherine's after a serious car accident. She had multiple internal injuries, a collapsed lung, and bleeding that required immediate surgical intervention. Under normal circumstances, this would be exactly the kind of complex trauma case that Dr. Martinez would handle personally. Instead, Dr. Martinez stood beside Elena as the supervising physician, ready to assist but increasingly confident that her intervention wouldn't be necessary. "Scalpel," Elena said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had performed this ritual thousands of times under conditions ranging from state-of-the-art facilities to bombed-out buildings. Dr. Chun, now serving as Elena's anesthesiologist for the 3rd time in 2 weeks, monitored his equipment with the relaxed confidence of someone working with a surgeon he trusted completely. "Vitals are stable, Elena. Blood pressure good. Oxygen levels perfect." Patricia Williams, who had requested to work Elena's surgeries whenever possible, handed over instruments with the smooth efficiency of a team that had worked together for years rather than weeks. The chemistry between Elena and her surgical team had developed with surprising speed. Elena made her initial incision with movements that were both precise and surprisingly gentle. Years of watching her work had convinced everyone at St. Catherine's that Elena's surgical technique was not just competent, but exceptional. Her hands moved with the confidence of someone who had learned surgery in circumstances where mistakes were immediately fatal. "Suction," Elena requested, and Patricia anticipated her need before the word was completely spoken. Dr. Martinez watched Elena's technique with fascination. 8 weeks ago, Elena had been a skilled surgical nurse. Today, she was demonstrating surgical abilities that rivaled physicians with decades of experience in American hospitals. Elena, Dr. Martinez said quietly, "Your approach to this internal bleeding is different from what I would normally do. Can you walk me through your thinking?" Elena continued working while she explained. In trauma surgery, especially when you suspect multiple sources of bleeding, the priority is rapid identification and control rather than perfect exposure. I'm using a technique I developed in Sarajevo when we had to operate quickly under bombardment. She demonstrated as she spoke, her hands moving with practiced efficiency through Maria's abdominal cavity. See how I'm exploring systematically, but quickly? This approach allows me to identify all sources of bleeding before committing to repair any single injury. Dr. Martinez leaned closer, genuinely interested in learning from Elena's approach. That's brilliant. It's more efficient than the standard protocol. It had to be, Elena replied with a slight smile. When you're operating by car headlights while shells are falling, efficiency isn't just preferred, it's survival. The surgery continued with Elena demonstrating techniques that none of her American colleagues had seen before. Her movements were economical, purposeful, and remarkably effective. She seemed to anticipate complications before they developed and prevented problems rather than simply reacting to them. Elena, Dr. Chin observed, your blood loss on this case is significantly lower than what we typically see with this type of trauma. How are you managing hemostasis so effectively? Elena paused in her work to share her approach. Dr. Chun, in resource-limited environments, you learn to achieve hemostasis with whatever tools you have available. Sometimes that means developing techniques that are more effective than standard approaches. She demonstrated a particular suturing technique that controlled bleeding while using minimal materials. This approach was developed out of necessity, but it's actually superior to conventional methods in many situations. Patricia Williams watched Elena's technique with amazement. As someone who had assisted hundreds of surgeries, she could recognize exceptional skill when she saw it. Elena's approach to surgery was like nothing she had ever witnessed. Dr. Volkov, Patricia said during a brief pause in the procedure, watching you work is like seeing surgery performed by someone from the future. Your techniques are so advanced. Elena's expression grew thoughtful. Patricia, my techniques were developed out of desperation rather than advancement. When you're forced to operate without proper instruments, without adequate lighting, without backup systems, you learn to innovate or you watch patients die. She returned her attention to Maria's injuries, working to repair a tear in the small intestine. What you're seeing is an advanced technique. It's surgery stripped down to its essential elements and rebuilt based on what actually works under impossible conditions. Dr. Martinez found herself learning from Elena with each case they worked together. The older woman's approach to surgery was fundamentally different from what was taught in American medical schools, yet consistently more effective in complex situations. Elena, Dr. Martinez said, I've been thinking about proposing you for a permanent position on our surgical staff. Your provisional status was supposed to be temporary while we completed your credentialing, but, frankly, you're already performing at a level that exceeds many attending surgeons. Elena's hands never paused in their work, but Dr. Martinez could see the emotion in her eyes. Sarah, 8 weeks ago, I was invisible in this room. Today you're discussing permanent staff positions. It still feels impossible. Dr. Chin spoke up from his position at the anesthesia station. Elena, there's nothing impossible about recognizing exceptional surgical ability. What's impossible is understanding how the medical system wasted your talents for over 2 decades. Elena completed the intestinal repair and moved on to addressing Maria's other injuries. Her efficiency was remarkable. What would typically be a 3-hour surgery was progressing much more rapidly without any compromise in quality. Dr. Volkov, Patricia observed, you're going to finish this surgery in record time. How are you working so efficiently? Elena's response carried the weight of hard-earned experience. Patricia, when you've operated while buildings collapsed around you, when you've had to complete surgery before ammunition ran out, You learn to work efficiently. Every movement has to count. As Elena worked to repair the final injury, Dr. Martinez reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. 2 months ago, Elena had been a mysterious nurse whose competence seemed to exceed her role. Today, she was demonstrating surgical skills that were reshaping how the entire surgical team approached complex cases. Elena, Dr. Martinez said, I want to ask you something personal. During all those years working as a nurse, watching other surgeons operate, was it frustrating to see procedures you could have performed yourself? Elena was quiet for a moment as she placed her final sutures. Sarah, frustration doesn't begin to describe it. Imagine being a concert pianist forced to work as a page turner. You love the music, you understand it better than anyone, but you can only participate by helping others perform. She secured the last suture and began to close Maria's incisions. But I learned something important during those years. Medicine isn't just about individual skill. It's about teamwork, communication, and using every person's expertise effectively. Dr. Chin finished adjusting Maria's anesthesia for the recovery phase. Elena, your experience working as part of a team while maintaining surgical-level knowledge has made you a better surgeon than if you had continued practicing without that perspective. Elena smiled as she stripped off her surgical gloves. Dr. Chun, adversity can be an excellent teacher if you're willing to learn from it rather than simply endure it. Maria's surgery had taken 2 hours and 15 minutes, nearly an hour faster than the typical timeline for such complex trauma. Her blood loss had been minimal, her vitals had remained stable throughout, and her prognosis was excellent. Dr. Martinez looked at Elena with unconcealed admiration. Elena, that was exceptional surgery by any standard. Your technique, your efficiency, your decision-making, it's all superior to what we typically see. Elena's response was characteristically modest. Sarah, good surgery is about serving the patient's needs rather than demonstrating the surgeon's abilities. Everything else is secondary. As the team prepared to transfer Maria to recovery, Dr. Hayes appeared in the operating room doorway. As chief of surgery, he had made it a point to observe several of Elena's procedures, and his presence today meant he had news to share. Dr. Volkov, Dr. Hayes said with obvious satisfaction, I have an update from the State Medical Board. Your full credentials have been approved. You're no longer practicing under provisional status. Elena stared at him, her composure finally beginning to crack. Dr. Hayes, does this mean? It means, Dr. Volkov, that you're officially a board-certified surgeon authorized to practice independently in this state. Your supervised practice period is complete. The operating room erupted in smiles and congratulations. Patricia Williams applauded openly. Dr. Chun reached over to shake Elena's hand. Dr. Martinez embraced her colleague warmly. Elena stood in the center of the celebration, overwhelmed by emotions she had suppressed for nearly 3 decades. The journey from invisible nurse to recognized surgeon had taken only 8 weeks, but the path that brought her to this moment had stretched across decades and continents. Dr. Hayes, Elena said when she could trust her voice, what happens now? Dr. Hayes smiled broadly. Now, Dr. Volkov, we'd like to offer you a permanent position as an attending surgeon on our trauma team. Your salary and benefits will reflect your level of experience and demonstrated competence. Elena felt tears she couldn't control streaming down her face. Dr. Hayes, I accept. The simple words carried the weight of a professional resurrection that had seemed impossible just weeks earlier. Dr. Martinez spoke up. Elena, there's something else. The hospital administration wants to establish a program for identifying and supporting other medical professionals who might be working below their qualifications due to documentation issues. Elena looked up with interest. A program? Dr. Hayes nodded. We want to call it the Volkov Initiative. Your case has made us realize that there might be other highly qualified medical professionals working in our system who haven't been able to demonstrate their full capabilities due to administrative barriers. Elena's voice was thick with emotion. You want to name a program after me? Patricia Williams grinned. Elena, You've shown us that extraordinary expertise can be hidden in plain sight. The Volkov Initiative could help other medical professionals who have been invisible the way you were. Elena sat down heavily in a nearby chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had happened. 8 weeks ago, she had been a ghost haunting Operating Room 7. Today, she was not only a recognized surgeon, but the inspiration for a program designed to help others in similar situations. "Doctors," she said quietly, "8 weeks ago, I saved one life by revealing my secret. Today, that revelation has saved my professional life and potentially the careers of other medical professionals who are trapped by circumstances beyond their control." Dr. Martinez sat beside her. "Elena, you've taught all of us something important. Excellence doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it works quietly in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to emerge." Elena looked around Operating Room 7 one more time, but now her perspective was completely different. This room was no longer her prison or her sanctuary. It was simply her workplace, a place where she could practice medicine at the level she had always been capable of. "Doctors," she said, standing with new dignity, "I'm ready to begin my career at St. Catherine's Medical Center. Not as Elena the Invisible Nurse, but as Dr. Elena Volkov, trauma surgeon." As the team dispersed to prepare for their next procedures, Elena remained in the operating room for a few moments alone. She thought about Maria Gonzalez, sleeping peacefully in recovery after surgery that had restored not just her life, but her future. She thought about Miguel Santos, whose near-death experience had been the catalyst for her own professional resurrection. Most of all, she thought about the other medical professionals who might be working in the shadows, their expertise unrecognized, their abilities underutilized, their potential unrealized. The Volkov Initiative would change that, one professional at a time. Dr. Elena Volkov, no longer invisible, no longer silent, walked out of Operating Room 7 ready to begin the next chapter of a medical career that had been interrupted but never truly ended. 6 months after her return to surgery, Dr. Elena Volkov stood before the annual medical conference at St. Catherine's Medical Center, looking out at an audience of physicians, nurses, and administrators from hospitals across 3 states. The conference room was packed beyond capacity, with additional attendees watching via video conference from other medical facilities. The topic of her presentation was hidden expertise, identifying and developing underutilized medical talent in healthcare systems. But everyone in attendance knew they were really here to hear the story of the invisible nurse who had become one of the most respected surgeons in the region. In the 6 months since her credentials had been restored, Elena had performed over 200 surgeries with outcomes that consistently exceeded national standards. More importantly, the Volkov Initiative had identified 12 other medical professionals working below their qualifications, including 2 physicians from war-torn countries, a nurse practitioner who had been unable to transfer her credentials between states, and a former military medic whose combat experience wasn't recognized by civilian medical systems. "Ladies and gentlemen," Elena began, her voice carrying the confident authority of someone who had found her proper place in the world. 8 months ago, I was invisible in this hospital, not because I chose to be, but because circumstances had convinced me that invisibility was my only option. She clicked to her first slide, showing a photograph of Operating Room 7. In this room, I worked for 8 years as a surgical nurse, watching procedures I could have performed myself, offering suggestions that came from surgical experience I wasn't allowed to acknowledge, and learning American medical techniques while suppressing my own medical knowledge. The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word. Today, I want to talk about the medical professionals who might be sitting in your own facilities, their expertise hidden by documentation issues, language barriers, or administrative obstacles that prevent them from practicing at their full capability. Elena advanced to her next slide, showing statistics from the Volkov Initiative's first 6 months. We've discovered that approximately 3% of medical support staff at participating hospitals have qualifications that exceed their current roles. That might not sound significant until you consider what it means in practical terms. She paused, allowing the implications to sink in. A 3% rate means that in a hospital with 500 staff members, there could be 15 people working below their qualifications. That represents enormous untapped expertise and, more importantly, unrealized potential to improve patient care. Dr. Martinez, sitting in the front row, smiled with pride as she watched Elena command the attention of some of the most prestigious medical professionals in the region. The transformation from invisible nurse to respected surgeon had been remarkable, but Elena's emergence as an advocate for underutilized medical talent was even more impressive. Let me share some examples from our initiative, Elena continued. We identified Dr. Ahmed Hassan, a Syrian cardiovascular surgeon who had been working as a hospital technician for 4 years. His credentials had been destroyed when his hospital was bombed, and he couldn't afford the process of recertification. Elena clicked to a photograph of a dignified man in surgical scrubs. Today, Dr. Hassan is Chief of Cardiovascular Surgery at Regional Medical Center, where he has introduced techniques for treating patients with limited resources that have improved outcomes across their entire cardiac program. The audience murmured with appreciation as Elena continued. We found Maria Santos, a nurse practitioner from Puerto Rico whose credentials weren't recognized when she moved to the mainland after Hurricane Maria. She had been working as a medical assistant despite being qualified to provide primary care. Elena's voice gained strength as she described the success stories. Today, Maria runs our rural health clinic, providing primary care to underserved populations using techniques she learned while working with limited resources in disaster areas. Elena advanced to her next slide, showing a veteran in uniform. Staff Sergeant Robert Chun had served as a battlefield medic in Afghanistan, performing emergency procedures under combat conditions. When he returned to civilian life, his military medical experience wasn't recognized by civilian healthcare systems. Elena smiled. Today, Sergeant Chun is completing his nursing degree while working in our emergency department, where his ability to remain calm under pressure and make rapid medical decisions has saved dozens of lives. The presentation continued with more examples of hidden expertise discovered through the Volkov initiative. Each story represented not just an individual success, but a multiplication of medical capability that benefited entire communities. The question, Elena said, advancing to her concluding slides, is not whether hidden medical expertise exists in your facilities. The question is whether you're committed to finding it and developing it. She paused, looking directly at the administrators in the audience. From an administrative perspective, the Volkov initiative represents an exceptional return on investment. Instead of recruiting expensive external talent, we're identifying and developing expertise that already exists within our systems. Elena clicked to a financial analysis slide. The cost of identifying and credentialing underutilized medical professionals is approximately 1/10 the cost of recruiting equivalent talent from outside sources. More importantly, these professionals bring perspectives and experiences that can't be found in traditional recruitment. Dr. Hayes, watching from the back of the room, reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. Elena's case had started as an individual success story, but had evolved into something much larger, a systematic approach to identifying and developing hidden medical talent. But the benefits extend beyond financial considerations, Elena continued. Medical professionals who have worked below their qualifications bring unique perspectives to patient care. They understand the healthcare system from multiple angles, they appreciate the value of teamwork, and they often possess innovative approaches developed through necessity. Elena advanced to her final slide, showing a photograph of the expanded surgical team at St. Catherine's. In my case, years of working as a surgical nurse while maintaining surgical-level knowledge made me a better surgeon than I would have been without that experience. I learned to see procedures from every team member's perspective, to anticipate problems before they developed, and to communicate effectively with all levels of medical staff. She looked out at the audience with conviction. The professionals we've identified through the Volkov initiative aren't just filling positions. They're elevating the performance of entire departments through their unique combinations of formal training and practical experience. Elena moved away from the podium, her presentation entering its final phase. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to challenge each of you to return to your facilities and look beyond job titles and official credentials. Look for the nursing assistant who asks unusually sophisticated questions. Notice the technician who seems to anticipate medical needs before they're expressed. Pay attention to the support staff member who offers insights that demonstrate medical knowledge beyond their apparent training. The audience was completely engaged, many taking notes on Elena's suggestions. Most importantly, Elena continued, create systems that allow these individuals to demonstrate their capabilities safely and systematically. Hidden medical expertise is a resource that costs nothing to identify, but can be invaluable once developed. Elena returned to the podium for her conclusion. 8 months ago, a medical emergency forced me to reveal knowledge I had been hiding for nearly 3 decades. That revelation saved one patient's life and ultimately transformed my own professional life. She paused, her voice carrying the weight of personal experience. But imagine if we didn't have to wait for medical emergencies to discover hidden expertise. Imagine if we actively sought out and developed the medical knowledge that exists within our facilities. Elena's final words resonated throughout the conference room. The Volkov Initiative has proven that extraordinary medical talent can be hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to recognize its value. Your facilities may contain medical professionals whose expertise could revolutionize patient care, but only if you're committed to finding them. The audience erupted in sustained applause as Elena concluded her presentation. During the question-and-answer session that followed, medical administrators from across the region requested information about implementing similar programs at their facilities. Dr. Martinez approached the podium as the crowd began to disperse. Elena, that was incredible. 6 months ago, you were worried about whether you could still practice surgery. Today, you're teaching medical leaders how to identify and develop hidden talent. Elena smiled, but her expression remained thoughtful. Sarah, this presentation was about much more than my personal story. It's about recognizing that medical expertise comes from many sources and takes many forms. Patricia Williams joined them, carrying a folder thick with contact information from interested administrators. Elena, I counted 17 hospitals that want to implement versions of the Volkov Initiative. You started something that could transform healthcare staffing across the entire region. Elena accepted the folder with genuine gratitude. Patricia, the goal was never to create a program named after me. The goal was to ensure that other medical professionals don't have to spend decades working below their qualifications because of administrative barriers. Dr. Chen approached the group, his expression showing deep satisfaction. Elena, the impact of your story extends beyond healthcare. You've demonstrated that exceptional ability can be hidden by circumstances and that institutions have a responsibility to seek out and develop talent wherever it exists. Elena nodded dojehashfully. Dr. Chun, my experience taught me that invisibility is often imposed rather than chosen. Creating systems that allow hidden expertise to emerge safely benefits everyone, the individuals, the institutions, and most importantly, the patients. As the conference attendees continued to network and exchange information, Elena stepped outside onto the hospital's healing garden balcony. The view encompassed the entire medical complex, including Operating Room 7, where her journey had begun 8 months earlier. Dr. Hayes joined her, carrying a document that brought a smile to his face. Elena, I have news. The American Medical Association wants to feature the Volkov Initiative in their national publication. They're calling it a model program for identifying and developing underutilized medical talent. Elena accepted the document with amazement. Dr. Hayes, 8 months ago, I was afraid to reveal that I was a surgeon. Today, the AMA wants to feature a program based on my experience. Dr. Hayes leaned against the balcony railing. Elena, your story resonates because it represents something universal. The possibility that exceptional ability exists in unexpected places. Medical professionals across the country have been inspired by your journey from invisibility to recognition. Elena looked out over the medical complex, her mind processing the extraordinary transformation her life had undergone. Dr. Hayes, the most important lesson from this experience isn't about my return to surgery. It's about the responsibility healthcare institutions have to recognize and develop all available medical expertise. Dr. Hayes nodded. Elena, you've changed how we think about staffing, credentialing, and professional development. The ripple effects of your story will impact healthcare delivery for decades. Elena's voice carried quiet conviction as she responded. Dr. Hayes, if the Volkov initiative helps even one medical professional transition from working below their qualifications to practicing at their full capability, then everything I experienced will have been worthwhile. As the sun set over St. Catherine's Medical Center, Elena reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. From invisible nurse to recognized surgeon to advocate for hidden medical talent, her story had evolved far beyond her personal redemption. The ghost of Operating Room 7 had become a symbol of untapped potential that existed throughout the healthcare system, waiting for institutions brave enough to look beyond traditional credentials and bold enough to develop talent wherever they found it. Elena Volkov's secret was no longer hidden. Instead, it had become a beacon, illuminating the path for other medical professionals trapped by circumstances beyond their control and inspiring healthcare institutions to recognize that their most valuable resources might be hiding in plain sight. In Operating Room 7 that evening, Elena performed her final surgery of the day, a complex trauma case that would have challenged any surgeon. As she worked with the confident precision of someone who had found her proper place in the world, she thought about the medical professionals who were still invisible in hospitals across the country. Tomorrow, she would continue working to ensure that their expertise wouldn't remain hidden for decades, as hers had been. The invisible nurse had become visible, but more importantly, she had dedicated her career to making sure that other invisible medical professionals would find their way into the light. Elena's story had become their story, and their success would be her ultimate triumph.